Good morning, friends. When all was said and done in the interaction between Jesus and the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15, verses 21 through 28, Jesus declared to the woman, "O woman, great is your faith." And then he healed her daughter even as she had requested him to do. And I'd like to take today to do what we just didn't have time enough to do this past Sunday, and that is actually take a look at how this great faith was put on display in this woman, in her actions and in her words. Because as we did conclude Sunday, Jesus did all he did in his interaction with her in the way he did, not only to express his faithfulness to his original mission in bringing the blessing of salvation first to the Jewish people, but also to put this woman's great faith on display. So let's take a deeper look at just what made this woman's faith so great. And the first thing we must understand is something we know to be true, but doesn't actually come to us from Matthew 15. Rather, we learn of it in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. Because there we read, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." Because even as we examine this Canaanite woman and the outpouring of her great faith, it is critical that we begin with the truth of Ephesians 2. Because this woman's faith was great, but it was not something she created in herself by her own power. It's not that she was smart enough, insightful enough, wise enough, clever enough, or anything else enough in and of herself to bring about this great faith. It was a gift given to her by God himself. Because if we make the mistake of saying, I need to have faith like the Canaanite woman because she managed to do these things, therefore I need to manage to do these things to show my great faith, well, then we are running along the cliff's edge of works righteousness, thinking that faith itself is a work we have to do, that it's something that we have to do purely in and of our own power, which would mean that since we're saved by faith, if we create our own faith and we cause ourselves to have faith and we exercise that faith in and of ourselves, then we are saving ourselves by our faith. But nothing could be farther from the truth. Yes, we do have faith, and it is our faith. And we do exercise that faith, but it comes to us from God as a gift, lest we boast in our own ability to create faith in ourselves toward God by our own efforts, which would be us saving ourselves. And so even as we consider the various elements of what made this Canaanite woman's faith so great, we don't do so for the purpose of creating a list that we're going to try to accomplish on our own. Instead, we recognize what this great faith looks like, and then we strive to demonstrate such things in complete reliance upon the power of God at work within us to do so. In other words, we recognize what great faith looks like, how it acts, what it says, what its motivations are, and then we go to the Lord and we say, Lord, create that faith in me. I can't drum it up inside myself. You have to work that power in me. And then we strive to live according to that faith, again, doing that striving in reliance upon the Lord rather than in reliance upon our own strength. And all of that process is actually then reflected in what the great faith actually looks like. Because consider the woman. The woman first interacts with Jesus in a manner of incredible humility, immediately declaring that she cannot save her daughter. She cannot do it on her own in her own power. She needs Jesus because she cries out, "Have mercy on me," and "Lord, help me." And this is a crucial, essential part of faith because we cannot save ourselves. We need him to provide that salvation. And this again is the first integral and enduring part of faith, this humility to look beyond yourself to Jesus. Second, the Canaanite woman knows who Jesus is, which is also absolutely essential because faith without knowledge is just a feeling. It's ephemeral. That is to say, it's temporary, fleeting, insubstantial. Faith without knowledge is what happens when people say, you just have to have faith. But then they don't tell you what you ought to have faith in. Because faith needs an object, a target. Faith is essentially a synonym for trust. And when you trust somebody or something to do something, which you can't do unless you know that person or that thing. As a very basic example, I trust my chair to hold me up because I know that it's built well and that I've sat in it thousands of times before and it has always held me up. To the much larger point, I trust Jesus because I know who he is, that he is the very Son of God, the Emmanuel, God with us, sinless, perfect in righteousness, the King of all kings, the Almighty. I know who he is, and therefore I put my trust in him because of what I know about him and that I know him relationally. And clearly the Canaanite woman knew who Jesus was too. She calls him Lord. She calls him Son of David. She knew he was the Messiah. And she knew by the grace of God, according to that gift of faith, that he was able, he was powerful and able to save her daughter. And so she had this strong faith, this absolute trust in him because she knew him, at the very least in the beginning, what she knew about him. And then she came to know him in a relationship. Then, according to both her knowledge of Jesus and her humility toward him, which we've already talked about, this led her to be reverent and submissive. At first, she appears to hang back, crying out to Christ from afar. This again is humility that leads to reverence and submission, knowing full well that she truly has no right to approach Jesus on her own, but she calls to him, seeking his mercy from a distance. And then when he responds, even as indirectly as he did, by first addressing the matter with his disciples rather than straight to her, well, then she approaches him closer. But even then, it's not to stand eye to eye and make demands, but rather she falls upon her knees, quite possibly prostrating herself on the ground before him, seeking his mercy and help from a posture, once again, of humility that leads to submission and reverence. And this is a very important concept because if you're listening to this devotion from America, certainly from probably any of the Western worlds in this modern era, you like me by our culture have probably had the idea instilled within you that personal pride, personal rights, personal autonomy are things to be prized above all else. And as such, we recoil at the thought of hitting our knees, putting our faces in the dirt, and bowing before anyone. But friends, when we stand before Jesus Christ on the final day, what are we told? Well, we won't be standing for long because every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And this woman is a wonderful example of that kind of reverence and submission. And we need to break through the sinful lessons we've been taught by our culture and by our own sinful nature, the lessons that reject concepts of reverence and submission, that we would indeed act in these ways toward the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, not just on the final day, but every day, to submit ourselves to him in reverence, because he is entirely deserving of such reverence and submission. Now, I am sure there's more elements we could consider of this woman's faith today, but the last I want to mention for the moment is the perseverance of her faith. And I only want to mention it because this is one that I really want to unpack all on its own in greater detail, if the Lord allows, in tomorrow's devotion. But I will say this as I did Sunday. Great faith is not just momentary. A faith that is great endures, it persists. And that's what this woman did. She knew that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, because she knew who he was, and she maintained her humility and submission toward him, and yet she persisted in seeking his blessing. And that, I think, is one of the things that really led our Lord to indicate the greatness of her faith. Just consider the words of Christ from Matthew 24:13, when he says, "But the one who endures to the end will be saved." How are we saved? Through faith. And what must that faith do? It must endure, persist. And praise be to God, the one who has genuine faith, given by God according to his grace, will endure. because he takes hold of us, he grants us faith, and he works it in us, and he accomplishes it, and he causes us to endure because he will not let us slip from his hand. So, in the light of all of God's goodness and grace, let us strive to demonstrate these qualities ourselves, striving in full reliance upon the power of God at work within us, approaching the Lord in prayer with humility, leading to reverence and submission, knowing who our God is and that he is good to keep his word. He is strong to provide all we need. And so therefore, let us strive and persist in asking, seeking, and knocking, as Christ put it, to receive this ever-increasing, ever greater faith from the Lord. Please think on these things, dear brothers and sisters, and have a good and godly day. Lord willing, I will see you soon.